Hey guys, so I had a question during my last stream about tips for hitscan heroes, and it ended up turning into this massive educational lecture. So I figured I'd post it here on my YouTube, just in case it's helpful for anyone else who missed the stream. For a little background on myself, so you can decide the value of my information, I am a projectile and off-tank player, but I do have a fair number of hours on hitscan heroes, and I've been playing the game since Season 3. I've achieved the rank of Grandmaster every season for the past 4 seasons, although I've really let my rank go recently and my highest account is Masters. But regardless of my current performance, I do think my knowledge is at least somewhat valuable still, and I hope this guide helps you. Feel free to comment below or message me on Discord or Twitter or when I'm live on Twitch if you have any questions about this guide. I do cover a lot in the video, so I'm sure there may be some things I don't explain properly. Alright, that's it for me. Thanks and enjoy the video. Okay, so let's talk about aim. So in Overwatch, there are 2 main kinds of weapons. Projectile and hitscan weapons. Examples of projectile are Genji, Hanzo, Mei, Junkrat, Torbjorn. Examples of hitscan are McCree, Soldier, Widowmaker, Tracer. Reaper as well is actually hitscan, and Sombra. Zarya is also hitscan left click, but projectile right click. So why is this important if you're trying to play McCree or something? So it changes the way that you aim, and I just want to cover this just in case you're not aware. So with projectile, you obviously want to lead your target, but also with projectile, there are certain situations where you cannot hit someone if they are aware of what you're trying to do and they have good movement and you are a certain distance. So the distance at which you can actually physically hit your shots if the enemy is perfectly good at dodging is dependent on the projectile speed, and it's also dependent on like their lag, their network lag and their input lag, because that changes their reaction time to your bullets. So Genji's projectiles are pretty slow, so you want to aim ahead of them. Let's take this guy for example, or we'll do this guy. So we have to aim about there, about that far ahead of him at that distance, and if we go further back, we have to aim further ahead of him. There he is. So you see, we actually have to like the physical distance between our crosshair and where we have to put the target increases the further away we are. But with hitscan, you have freedom, and this is why projectile heroes in Overwatch do more damage per shot on average than hitscans do. So McCree, if he gets a headshot on you, he does 140 damage. Whereas Hanzo, if he headshots you, he does 250 damage. So he gets an extra 110 damage. It's a fuck ton of damage. But the reason why it's that way is because of the way the aim works. So if you keep distance on Hanzo and you're like, well, there's a couple things you want to do on Hanzo. You generally actually want to go Genji into Hanzo, but anyway. Point is, on hitscan, your advantage is that you can always hit shots physically. You can't see my dots. You mean like my aim reticle? It's just because it's really small. It's because I have a... I'm 1920 by 1080, so I can see it, but on the stream you're not going to be able to see my crosshair. It's just in the center of the screen, though. It'll always be in the center of the screen. So you don't actually need to really see it. So let's talk about aim styles with hitscan, knowing this fact that we can always hit shots, and the way shots are calculated is, when you press left click, the game calculates on your end locally, not through network, if you are looking at the target, and if there's anything between you and the target. If there's nothing between you and the target, and your reticle... like if a line is drawn from where your character is standing into the direction your reticle is pointing, and that line intersects with an enemy, then it will instantly deal damage. That's the way it works. I think it's called raycasting, but we call it hitscan. So it's scanning. So knowing that, there's a couple of techniques for you. Basically, the only time that it matters where your reticle is the moment you're pressing left click. So this is why people flick instead of tracking on heroes like McCree. So yes, I could track on McCree, but it's actually unnecessary. And the reason why it's worse than flicking is because there are 3 steps to tracking. First, you acquire the target, okay? So like my reticle's here, and now I see this bot over here, right? So I have to acquire the target, and now second step is I have to track it. So I have to adjust my reticle to where he's going to move next. So I use prediction for that in part, like I know he's going to move in that way, and that's why you saw my reticle go a little bit past him when he stopped, because I'm predicting him to go there. So there's prediction and then there's reaction, and those work together to track. And you're using a mixture of wrist movements and minute, or of smooth arm movements and minute wrist movements to do tracking. So that's the second step, and the third step is to fire. So there's 3 steps with tracking, but with flicking, you can increase your accuracy by reducing the number of steps. So you don't always have to track it because you do not have to react to its motions. You just have to see where it is and then put your crosshair there and fire in the same motion, right? So there's 2 ways you can flick actually. You can flick to the target and fire, or you can flick past the target and hit it as you flick past. And that's my aim style now on Hanzo. I used to flick to, and I've changed my style since. So you can do whatever's best for you. When I'm playing McCree, I do this flicking to the target style. So what I'm doing is I'm not looking here. I'm looking at the target over there, and I'm starting here and I'm flicking to the target. Right? So the reason why I reset is so that way it's the same motion every time. Because if I move here, then where my mouse is changes, and the muscles in my arm that I use to aim changes a little bit. But if I do this, then it's consistent, right? Okay, well I missed every shot there, but the muscle group is consistent, so it leads to more consistent shots. And that leads me, speaking of muscle groups, to talking about arm aiming versus wrist aiming. You may have heard of this term before, but basically, it's actually not as complicated as you'd think. Basically, imagine you're wearing a wrist brace. You all know what a fucking wrist brace is. Here we go. So imagine you're wearing a wrist brace. So that's actually going to completely prevent, or mostly prevent, your wrist from moving. So imagine you're wearing that, and imagine how you would move the mouse with the wrist brace on. That is arm aiming. Another way to tell if you're arm aiming correctly is if your shoulder and your pectoral muscles are used in your aiming, and to some degree your upper arm. So if those muscles are being used, then you're probably arm aiming correctly. And don't forget though that when you're actually aiming in game, it's not going to be like that. What I just defined there is pure arm aiming, but everyone uses a mixture of wrist and arm aiming. So if I purely arm aim, I'll do that for you right now. It's going to look really smooth.
No payment required. This one's on the house.
So this is pure arm aiming. And this smoothness, this is why we use it. Because of that smoothness, so it's extremely consistent. But because you have to move several muscle groups, you actually physically have to move more stuff in real life, so it's slower. And that's why we don't just use arm aiming on its own. That's why we use a mixture of wrist aiming. So if I use pure wrist aiming, this is what it looks like. So wrist aiming is actually the best aiming technique for tracking, and arm aiming is the best aiming technique for flicking. But you always, like I said, you want to use a mixture of them. So what I do, especially at long ranges, is I'm doing minute adjustments to where the target is. So I'm tracking in between flicks. That way I'm always setting myself up for easy and consistent flicks. So I'm never just keeping my crosshair perfectly still, right? That's what it looked like if I didn't track in between flicks. You can do that if you want, but like, you don't really want to. Right? It's just less consistent because you're constantly doing a different motion. And also, the further away you are from a target, the harder the flick is to hit, right? So why make things harder on yourself than you need to? Make them easy on yourself. So that's why we do a mixture of tracking and flicking. And you see this especially on Widowmaker. I know I've shown just like McCree so far here, but this applies to every hit scan here, all the things I just talked about. So on Widow, you want to track to the target, usually about body level, and then flick up to the head, neck area. You'll see that I kind of do a diagonal flick, but also I'm not really a Widowmaker player, so I wouldn't really copy exactly what I do on Widow. A great Widow to watch would be Codebreaker. He streams all the time, and he's fantastic at Widowmaker. Twitch.tv/Codebreaker, VT, not TV, VT. Also, obviously, another really good Widowmaker is Kefri. There's Linkser, Carpe. There's so many that you could watch. Surefour. I could keep naming them. The list goes on. There's no shortage of good Widowmaker players. Did you try no crosshair? Yeah, but I found that it wasn't good because sometimes I do want to look to see where my crosshair is. But that, again, segues into a good point. I already mentioned it, but I really got to emphasize, it's really important where you put your eyes on your screen. You should almost never be looking at the crosshair itself. You should almost always be looking at the head of the target you want to hit. And you do want to almost always aim for the head. There are some situations where it's like, no matter whether you hit the head or the body, you're going to get the kill. So like if you know that just getting body shots, you can get the kill, and you know there's nothing they can do if you hit all body shots, then that's a situation where you might want to intentionally aim for the body. And you'll see me do this on Hanzo pretty often, mostly because of the projectile hero stuff I talked about earlier. Because at certain distances it's impossible to guarantee a headshot, right? Like I said earlier with this bot on Genji, based on his movement, I can predict where I need to aim to hit the headshot. So I missed that one, but you can predict, right? But the thing is, these are bots and they're not reacting to anything I'm doing. But real players do react and sometimes move randomly, which is why you AD strafe. So although I have to aim ahead of this guy and I can guarantee a headshot, if it's a real player, what if he just sidestep to the right the moment I let go of the trigger? He will dodge my shot. So, did I cover all that? Does that make sense? Should I talk about engage positioning stuff now? Because that is literally just aim I talked about, and there's actually a lot more than just aim to talk about. There's also movement. I should probably talk about movement as well. One really important thing you should learn is to counter your aim with your movement. So here you can see I'm doing a mixture of wrist and arm aiming, and I'm trying to counter my own movement. So obviously you know where you're gonna move, right? So you should in theory be able to perfectly counter your movement because you know exactly when you're gonna move and how much you're gonna move by, and therefore you should be able to predict how much you need to move your crosshair to account for that, right? So one important thing to do, and this is just like a practice drill you should do a little bit every day, is practice trying to keep your crosshair on a target as you AD strafe around them. Do this at varying ranges, and this is a tracking skill. Okay, let's talk about movement as well. Okay, so there is movement that helps your aim, and there's movement that hurts your aim, and you should be aware of if you're doing a movement, if it's going to make it easier or harder for you to hit that shot. At the same time, you don't want to be completely dependent on your movement, in part because it limits your movement. So if you're relying on your movement to aim all the time, so like for example, if I don't touch my crosshair, if I don't touch my mouse at all, and I only use movement to, let's start centered here, and I only use movement to help me aim, then it's predictable by the enemy, for one, but it also limits your movement, right? So if you want to be dodging a shot, like say you're playing against a Hanzo and you want to be dodging the Hanzo arrow, if you're using your movement entirely to aim, then you might move into the Hanzo arrow to try to help yourself aim. So you don't want to do that, obviously, but you should be aware of what movement helps your aim so that you can do it depending on circumstance. So for me, I find if I'm moving the same direction that I'm about to flick in, it makes it easier for me to hit the flick. But I do think that largely you shouldn't rely on movement for aim, especially on a hero like Widow. But on a hero like McCree or Ashe, I think that movement is actually a lot more important. I'm not an expert on movement. I'm not an expert on Hitscan either, I don't think. So I won't talk too much more about that topic. But just be aware that your movement does affect your aim. And I'd recommend looking at probably Sureforce tutorials on top of this because I don't want to give incorrect information. It's really prevalent on Ashe, actually. I think Ashe is probably the hero that's affected most by movement in the entire game. So when you're ADSing with Ashe, that's when you'll notice it the most. So you don't want to be doing huge mouse flicks with Ashe as much as you want to be doing movement into your shots when you're ADSing. You'll notice this a lot if you watch like Surefor or Effect or anyone really who's a high level player playing Ashe, is they'll move into their ADS shots. Be aware it's a thing you should consider. Another thing that I can talk about, and this is actually really, really important, especially for Hitscan, is input latency. So this is not your internet connection. This is your local latency. This is the time it takes for an input you make in real life. So like it's from when your brain gives the command to the rest of your body to try to kill this bot. So my brain's like, okay, hit that headshot. The moment I think that, the time between that moment and the time it takes to actually hit the shot, oops, just completely miss. That is called input lag. And there's a couple factors. So there's your mouse, obviously. Then there's your computer. And then there's your monitor. So your mouse is probably not going to be a problem, but your computer usually is. And you can see the input latency on your computer by looking at the SIM here, the simulation time. So this is the number of milliseconds in between each frame basically rendered. So obviously if you have higher frames, you're going to reduce this number. But there's also some other stuff that can affect this. So press Control Shift N in game to bring that up. Control Shift N in game, and that will bring up this screen. And yeah, so obviously having a higher refresh rate monitor as well will reduce this. So a higher refresh rate monitor, it won't show up here, but it will feel smoother. And that smoothness you feel, how responsive things feel, that is you feeling input lag. A good number would be 3 milliseconds. That's a really good number for input lag. A bad number is 15 milliseconds. That's like the high end of like the highest tolerable. Probably like 8 milliseconds is still like barely tolerable, to be honest. But it's diminishing returns. The lower you get, the less it matters. So the things you want to do to reduce that, obviously, is you want to reduce your settings. This is really, really important if you're a competitive player over a casual player. So if you're competitive, then act like it and set your settings to stuff that isn't just to please your eyes, and it's instead stuff to get wins. So render scale you want as low as possible, but so that you can still see the people on the, you can still see things. So if I set this to 200% right now, take a look at how nice the game looks now. Everything looks so fucking smooth. I don't know if you guys can see this in the actual stream, but the problem is now I have 80 FPS and I have 3 dots here, and we'll talk about those 3 dots in a minute here as well. So I don't know I'm going back to spawn room for, but yeah. So it's really important that you set up your graphics correctly. The graphics I have now are the graphics I'd recommend you have. The reason why I have everything on low except for shadow detail is I found that only on mediums I actually see shadows of enemy players rendered. I think low might work for most people as well, and maybe it will work for me too, and I just tested it wrong, but I couldn't see shadows on low, so I turned it to medium and then I could. Everything here is what's important. Stream start quality doesn't matter. Actually, local reflections and ambient occlusion does matter. But yeah, just set everything to low. And your frame rate cap, I'd recommend actually having it 300. I used to recommend having it like, if you usually get like 140 frames or something, I usually recommend setting it to the normal frames you get minus a little bit. That way it's consistent, because if you take a dip in frames, then your input lag increases, and then you need to change how far you lead targets, right? But I find that I always want like the most frames possible, so I keep it on uncapped, or at 300 rather. You can actually get it to go even higher than 300 frames per second if you really want to. You can go into your settings, which is in your documents. So just go into your documents folder, find Overwatch settings, and open up the INI file. You can open this with the regular Notepad. That comes installed with Windows, but I use Notepad++. So right here where it says frame cap, you can change the variable to whatever you want, really. I think if you go much higher than 400, you start to get into problems. But I can set this to 400 reliably on my system. So set that to whatever you want, save it, and close it. But do note that the moment that you go into your settings in Overwatch, it's going to reset to the highest number available with in-game settings, so 300. So unfortunately, because of the reduced buffering glitch, you're pretty often going to be going into your settings very briefly just to toggle that setting. So I wouldn't recommend getting used to a high FPS, because yeah, it's not going to stick around. But you can see here, it's going over 300 FPS, and if you go into a spot where there's not a lot going on the practice range, so it's really easy on your system, you can see it's going out to 3500, and if I'm not recording, this stays stable at 400 on my system on low graphics settings. So depending on your system, you can go even higher than 300 FPS. But yeah, the second you go into options and video, you're gonna see it's immediately gonna see it says 400 right now, but if I toggle this, you can see now it's stuck at 300. It's never gonna go above 299. It automatically goes back to that because when you click apply, it saves everything here, and the maximum output that this setting can give is 300. So I wouldn't get used to a setting above 300 for that reason, because you're probably not going to go into your fucking INI file to reset your reduced buffering. But maybe you will, I don't know. But yeah, there's a tip for you just in case you were curious. So, okay, so let's talk about the 3 dots here now. This is another reason why you really want the FPS thing showing. So if I go into options, video, advanced performance stats, show frame rate on. The reason why you want that on is so that you can see these 3 dots. So if I tab out, you'll see these 3 dots show up. So let me tab out. There, now you can see them. There's 3 dots there. So anytime that happens, you want to do options, video, and then you see where it says reduce buffering. You want to turn it off, apply, and then turn it back on and press apply. And by the way, you can, whenever options highlighted, you can press the space bar to toggle it on or off. So actually the thing I do is I click on options video, click it off, and then I press space bar and then click it apply again. That's the fastest way to do it. But yeah, anyway, the reason why I do that is because this is glitched, and that's why the 3 dots sometimes appear. Sometimes reduce buffering, even though it's set to on, it will have the effect of being off, and that's what causes those 3 dots. The 3 dots, they talk about buffering. So although you get this frame number, there may be some buffering intermittently in between frames, and that's what those 3 dots are telling you. So get rid of those, because buffering makes your input lag laggier, and we don't like lag in gaming. We want things to be responsive. Alright, another tip I can give you for reducing input latency is, like, obviously you want to close all background applications that you're willing to while you're playing the game, because it will reduce the load on your CPU, which will free up more system use for Overwatch, which will allow you to get better frames, which will reduce input latency. But if you insist on having some programs open, I can give you a tip for Discord. If you go into the user settings and into appearance, you can turn off hardware acceleration. It's on by default, and it uses your GPU, and you want your GPU to be free for Overwatch. For Overwatch itself, let me start up real quick here. You want to go into your task manager once it's running. There we go. Best to do that is Control-Shift-Escape. And you should see it here if you're sorting by really anything, because it's a monster of an application. And yeah, you can go to Details. You'll have to expand this. Go to Details. And that'll bring you to the Details tab, and right to Overwatch. And you can right click on that, set priority, and set it to high. And that will basically, if the system runs out of resources, it will prioritize keeping Overwatch running healthily over something else. This can make your frames more stable in Overwatch and get higher frames in general as well if your system's constantly full. Something else I should go over as well is your sensitivity. So in Overwatch, there's 2 things we're trying to accomplish with our sensitivity. The first is we want a low sensitivity so that at long ranges, we have more fine control. So let me go to extremes here just to show you. So my natural is 5.2 at 800 DPI. Let's try 100. Okay, so now it's really easy to go crazy, but like you'll notice there's pixel skipping going on. So long ranges, it's actually like the mouse itself is not accurate, but more so in real life, even the slightest muscle twitch and I go off target. So you want a low sensitivity so that way you can use all of your muscles instead of having to like be really delicate and careful about which one you use. You want them to all be useful to you, not all be a liability to you. So that's why you want a low sensitivity for long range. But if you have too low of a sensitivity, let's go to the other extreme. Like, yes, it's super smooth, and at long ranges, like, it's like the easiest thing in the... Oh my god, I'm still missing. I'm not used to sensitivity. Oh god, holy shit, it's like I'm moving a pile of bricks. Anyway, so at long ranges, it's much smoother, is what I'll say. But if I want to turn around, if a tracer teleports behind me, okay, there's one full sweep of my mouse pad, and there's a second one. I have to readjust the mouse again, so that way I'm in the center of my mouse pad. So it takes a while. And you obviously don't want to be like picking your mouse up and off your mouse pad over and over again like that. That's just, yeah, you're going to be breaking your arm every time you try to hit a tracer behind you. So obviously these are extremes. But yeah, I'm just trying to demonstrate that you want to find a middle ground. And for me, the middle ground is 5.2. Note though, when you're setting your sensitivity, that this number on its own means absolutely nothing. Right? You could have a sensitivity of 5.2 in game, same as me, but have double the the effective sensitivity. That's because of the way DPI works. So let me tab out, and I'll show you my desktop again. Depending on which mouse you have, you should have some mouse software that came with the mouse. So I have a Logitech G502, and it comes with this software. And somewhere in your mouse software, there's going to be a setting for DPI. It's your dots per inch. And this number multiplied by your in-game sensitivity is your effective DPI. And you want an effective DPI of around 5K probably. Well, I don't know, 4K to like 6K. So like Raxu actually uses 5 in-game and 800 DPI. So 5 in-game sensitivity, 800 DPI, effective DPI of 4K. That's kind of like on the lower end. You can maybe go for 3.5K. And depending on your aim style, you could go higher than that. Wrist aimers generally have a higher sensitivity. But for arm aimers, I wouldn't recommend much more over like 6K. So 6K divided by 800 DPI would look like 7.5 cents in-game. So there you go. Experiment with that a little bit. A lot of people say that sensitivity is personal preference. In reality, it's not personal preference. There's just a lot of variables that go into what makes a sensitivity right for each person, and every person is different. So that's why it's called personal preference, but there is a correct answer. It's just no one can tell you what the correct answer is because no one knows enough information about you specifically. Only you do. So you've got to figure that out for yourself. But basically, yeah, just set a DPI that's reasonable. You don't want too low or too high of a DPI because too low of a DPI, you get pixel skipping, and too high of a DPI, I believe you start getting like the computer will miss input from the mouse sometimes, which will make like really fast flicks less accurate or less consistent. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's why you don't want too high of a DPI. But basically, as long as it's like a multiple of like 100 or 200, you should be okay. You know, Overwatch pros use anything from 200 to 1600 usually DPI. So DPI is a lot more lenient as long as the product of the DPI and the sensitivity is something that results in reasonable turning. But yeah, experiment with it. And depending on depending on your aim style, you know, that will dictate your sensitivity. Though I would recommend that almost everyone, unless you've spent years training yourself as a wrist aimer, I'd recommend that almost everyone do arm aiming with, of course, a little bit of a mixture of wrist aiming. Oh yeah, positioning as well. Let's go over a map or two and just briefly talk about positioning tips for Hitscan. So obviously it depends on your composition and where the enemy's playing from. Let's start. What's a good Widow map? Let's start with the Junkertown map. Okay. So there's a couple principles for each Hitscan hero. I should probably talk about Ashe too, but I don't have a lot of experience with Ashe. But let's start with Widow, since that was the original question. So because Widow can kill in one shot, the enemy has to play around you such that they have a way to survive your one shot, unless they want to challenge your aim. So let's assume you have perfect aim and you're an aimbot. If you're standing here, you are what's called protecting or covering this sight line. So they can't push here, they can't push here, they can't push here, they can't push here, and if I move this way, they can't push there. So that's what's strong about this position. What's weak about this position is I could be killed from here if they have a counter sniper. So you have to be careful about that, and you have to know which sideline to watch to keep yourself safe from other snipers. As it says in the automatic tooltip, other snipers are your biggest threat on Widow. But yeah, so if they're pushing from behind a shield, then they're protecting themselves against your sightline. On Widow, you can create space by having sightlines covered, but if they push with the shield, then they can take that back. So usually mains can be protected by like a shield or something if they have a brain. So what you're actually looking for on Widow is ways to create that pressure and get those picks. Those are like your two jobs in Widow. Obviously, you don't want to die. That's one job. You want to get and finish kills, and you want to create pressure to enforce some positioning. And on Junkertown, what usually happens is the enemy team will push main, they'll have pressure there from their tanks, and then they'll rotate around the flanks with their DPS. And you should look to do that as well. You know, on Junkertown at the highest level, they basically kind of get first point for free as far as I know. But there's definitely things you can do, especially at lower levels. So you know, you can start with hook shots and stuff to start off with. That's a way to get picks. And also, if you're constantly, or not constantly, but if you flanks when appropriate, then you're not only getting picks, you're creating pressure. Like I said earlier, that's one of your main jobs. So if you're here, and the Reinhardt shield is here facing toward your team, so like let's say the card's like right here, where this Widowmine is, the enemy Reinhardt has to block here, right, against the enemy off tank and the enemy projectile DPS. And the enemy main tank. They have to stand there with their shield facing that way. But if you're standing here, then the shield's not bothering you, and you're creating pressure because they have to deal with you. So whether you get picks or not, what you're doing is you're pulling them away from their front line, which is allowing your front line to crush theirs. So just you existing here helps your front line. So whether you get a pick or not, you're creating a threat, and then you're immediately escaping. You're creating pressure. And that's one of your main jobs on Widow. So the main playstyle for Widow is play back so that you don't get dove. Be aware of your grapple. If you don't have grapple up, you can't be playing in a risky position where you could be dived, or dove rather, because otherwise you're just dead and you're a liability for your team. You're relying on your teammates to bail you out then. So just be aware of that. Your grappling hook is like your only escape ability. Even with grappling hook, sometimes you can't like escape in time. So try to predict enemy dives. And yeah, create pressure, get picks. Obviously, aim is really important on Widow as well. You almost always want to aim for the head because Widow, unlike any other hero, has a 2.5 times multiplier for headshots. So she does 120 damage for body shot and 300 for headshot, which is the highest damage per bullet in the game, I believe. Yeah, you don't usually want to shoot at shields. You usually want to like another thing you can do with Widow actually is, speaking of shields, if the Rein is, let's pretend I'm still Widow and I'm like standing here and the Rein is hard shielding. So what I can do is I can place my reticle over like a squishy standing behind a shield, and the moment he drops the shield to fire strike or whatever shield hop, then I pull the trigger. So you can track their head, and then as soon as he drops the shield, flick up the target and get the kill. So that's another tactic you can use in Widow. There's a lot of tactics for each hero. I'd recommend you watch people that are known for the hero and look up guides for more detail on that. But that's the basics behind Widowmaker. For McCree, you're much more playing with your front line and your utility for Flashbang. That's like the main strength behind McCree. He's a right-click machine now. Obviously, if you hit headshots, it's good. But yeah, his Flashbang actually, depending on the elo, makes him really, really, really good for flanks, because even if you get caught out, you can usually flashbang and get one kill and trade. On defense, that's not as optimal as on offense because of the way respawns work. Usually a trade is good for the offense and bad for the defense, but because of the chance of you getting more than one kill, even on defense, flanking is pretty strong for McCree. Because say you trade one time, the next time you get 2 kills, then it almost evens out the amount you lose for the trade. If you're playing defense, if you're playing offense, then it's even better, right? So you do want to flank a fair amount with McCree. You do want to try to go for the flashbangs and right clicks, and yeah, aim for the head, forehead. Obviously, tech like being able to flash above the Reinhardt shield is good. One thing you may not know though is if you flash above and the Reinhardt just looks straight up to try to block it, you can actually mind game him, look up as if you're gonna flash him, and then flash underneath of his skirt, and you can flash him that way. Some big brain stuff right there for McCree. But yeah, main thing for McCree is just mostly play frontline. Be aware that you're low mobility, so you can't get away the same way even Widow could get away, because you can just roll. That's it. So you have to really rely on your flashbang and be aware of where your team is playing and really play with your tanks mostly or flank. Soldier's not good now. He's actually a really, really bad pick now. But at lower elo, you can make him work if you have good mechanics. and if you're just a good player in general, because he's self-sufficient. He has his own healing station. The reason why Soldier is picked is for his mobility and his ability to just be a pain in the ass constantly for the enemy. By himself, he can stand here, create problems to the enemy, and he can just run away. He doesn't even have to go back to his teammates. He can just run straight away, and he can just be constantly in the back line, creating problems, getting picks. He has a really fast time to kill with his Helix. You can do 120 damage for a direct hit. It's the same thing as far as left click, and then you can get some headshots, which I believe they do 19 damage per bullet, and then 38 damage if it's a headshot. So if you get 2 headshots, a body shot, and a Helix, it'll kill a 200 HP hero. So that's Soldier. You want to be playing flanks. You also want to be shooting tanks a lot with Soldier because his value is in consistent damage, not in burst damage. Although he does have a Helix, that's his only source of burst damage. So you want to be shooting the enemy tanks a lot, actually, because consistent damage is strong against tanks. Because on a DPS, it's hard to hit those shots, but on a tank, it's almost guaranteed. Even once your shots get less accurate, and your shots are perfectly accurate for the first 4 shots on Soldier, but then they get less accurate. So even after that, they start getting less accurate after those first 4 shots. On tanks, you can just hold down left trigger because of the size of the hitbox on the enemy tanks, and you can keep hitting shots into them, even headshots sometimes, constantly. So that's why it's good to usually be shooting tanks with a Soldier. But obviously, that said, if you can get a pick, then you should do that. Almost always on any hero. Okay, any questions, students? Does that cover everything? Hopefully that helps. Mittens the kittens. And episode. But yeah, really try to get your input latency down. Obviously, hardware, like the kind of computer you have, plays a big role in that. But also your settings matter. But yeah, try to develop your aim styles and your positioning and your tactics, your knowledge of tactics. So a tactic, for example, is the flashing above Reinhardt's shield, or on Widow, tracking someone behind a Reinhardt shield until the Reinhardt drops the shield and then headshotting them. That's a tactic. A strategy is like flanking pretty consistently or something. How many placements have you done? I think we're at 7. Yeah, we're at 7 out of 10 right now. We only lost 1 game so far.